It is said that a lie travels around the world, while the truth is still busy tying its bootlaces, and no wonder, since false narratives, unrestricted as they are by facts, are usually juicier and more fascinating than the humdrum, and often more boring reality. Take the controversies surrounding the depiction of British Queen Charlotte as black in Netflix's hit series Bridgerton, or the widely accepted but false notion that the Aztecs thought the Spanish conquistadors were gods. Following are 20 things about those and other popular historic facts that are untrue. Number 20. Take the controversies surrounding the depiction of British Queen Charlotte as black in Netflix's hit series Bridgerton. Pioneering mobster Lucky Luciano became America's biggest narcotics trafficker and distributor. Contra, the false notion popularized by movies and works of fiction that the mob traditionally avoided narcotics. Dealing drugs was one of the Italian-American mafia's biggest moneymakers since its earliest days. It is often asserted that the mafia had a long-standing prohibition against drug trafficking, either because of morality or because of the public stigma attached to drugs. That is as false gets. The notion that the mafia stayed away from drugs is just a myth, popularized by fiction and Hollywood hits such as The Godfather. In reality, the mafia was heavily involved in the drug trade from the start. Long before the days of Pablo Escobar, pioneering mafioso Lucky Luciano became America's and one of the world's biggest narcotics kingpins. For decades, the mafia was the biggest importer of hard drugs into the U.S., particularly heroin. It was not until cocaine replaced heroin as the hard drug of choice, and the rise of the Colombian cartels in the 1970s, that the mob lost its top billing as America's biggest drug trafficker. Number 19. The Roman Empire did not actually fall in 476 AD. The year 476 AD is commonly assumed to be, and is widely accepted as the traditional end date for the Western Roman Empire, as well as the end of ancient Rome. It is a false assumption. The Western Roman Empire's end was not abrupt. It was a gradual process. In 476, contemporaries hardly noticed that anything special had happened. What had actually happened that year was that a military strongman, Odoacer, beat another military strongman, Orestes, to become the power behind the throne. It was not a big deal by then. Western Roman emperors had long since been reduced to puppets. After his victory, Odoacer forced Orestes' son, the 16-year-old Emperor Romulus Augustulus, to abdicate. Augustulus' imperial regalia was then sent to the other Roman emperor in Constantinople, who confirmed Odoacer as ruler of Italy in the now sole Roman emperor's name. On the ground, little changed in Italy or the rest of the Western Roman Empire. Most people who lived in 477 would not have noticed anything particularly different from 476. Number 18. The false story of a wrongly executed World War II deserter. The execution of Private Slovik, a 1974 movie starring Martin Sheen, posthumously catapulted Eddie Slovik, a U.S. Army private executed for desertion during the Second World War, to fame. It also made his fate, which was depicted in the movie as a miscarriage of justice, into a cause célèbre. To the extent that people today know of Eddie Slovik, most associate him with the miscarriage of justice depicted in the film. That portrayal is false, whatever one's position on the death penalty. Slovik's fate was one that he brought upon himself. His conviction and execution stemmed from a cynical scheme he had tried to carry out that ended up backfiring in spectacular fashion. Edward Donald Slovik was a delinquent and troublemaker from early on. Fighting, stealing cars, breaking into and burglarizing homes were just some of the crimes he did and did time for. Indeed, his record was so bad that when he tried to enlist in the army in 1942, he was designated 4F on grounds of being morally unfit for service in the military and rejected. A year later, by which time Slovik had gotten married, the military began to feel a growing manpower crunch and had second thoughts about people like Slovik, so he was reclassified as fit for service and drafted. Number 17. A determination to desert. Eddie Slovik was sent to France in August 1944, where he was assigned to Company G of the 28th Infantry Division's 109th Infantry Regiment. On the way to join his unit, Slovik came across a Canadian military police unit and ended up staying with them for 6 weeks. He finally reported to his assigned unit on October 7, 1944, and promptly decided that serving in a frontline infantry company was not for him. The following day, he asked his company commander for reassignment to a unit in the rear. Slovik threatened that he was prepared to run away if he was assigned to a rifle unit on the front lines. His captain told him that if he did that, it would count as desertion, denied his transfer request, and assigned him to a rifle platoon. The next day, October 9th, Slovik deserted. He walked several miles towards the rear until he reached a headquarters detachment, There, he approached one of their cooks and provided him with a prepared note, confessing to desertion. Number 16. A damning confession. As Eddie Slovik confessed, I, Edward Donald Slovik, 36,896,415, confessed to the desertion of the United States Army. At the time of my desertion we were in Albaf in France. I came to Albaf as a replacement. They were shelling the town and we were told to dig in for the night. The following morning they were shelling us again. I was so scared, nerves and trembling, that at the time the other replacements moved out, I couldn't move. I stayed there in my foxhole till it was quiet and I was able to move. I then walked into town, not seeing any of our troops, so I stayed overnight at a French hospital. The next morning I turned myself over to the Canadian Provost Corps. After being with them 6 weeks I was turned over to American MP. They turned me loose. I told my commanding officer my story. I said that if I had to go out there again I'd run away. He said there was nothing he could do for me, so I ran away again and I'll run away again if I have to go out there. Number 15. Contra the false narrative of being a victim of injustice. Eddie Slovik had concocted a cynical scheme to manipulate the system. Contra the narrative that Private Eddie Slovik had been an innocent ground down by an unforgiving system, his desertion and confession were part of a cynical scheme. Slovik seems to have figured that confessing to desertion would get him sent to jail. As a former jailbird who had done multiple stints behind bars, jail held no terrors for him, as he saw it staying safe, sound, dry and well-fed in a military prison was preferable to risking life and limb, and dealing with the cold and mud and other hardships of front-line combat. To be sure, desertion could be punished with death. However, nobody during the war had been executed for that offense. Slovik's logic seems to have run along the lines of let the other suckers get shot up or maimed. By inviting the military to punish him, and embracing that punishment, he would achieve his goal of avoiding hazardous duty, and sit out the war in safety behind bars in a military prison. It was a foolproof way to game the system and manipulate it for his benefit, or so Slovik thought. Number 14. Eddie Slovik rejected multiple opportunities to save himself. Eddie Slovik's confession made its way to his commander, who read it and told him to destroy it and avoid arrest. He declined. He was taken to a higher-ranking officer, who told Slovik that if he tore up the confession and returned to his unit, no further action would be taken. Immune to good advice, he refused. He was then instructed to write another note on the back of his confession, stating that he understood the legal ramifications of deliberately incriminating himself, and that his note could be used against him during a court-martial. Slovik, seemingly impervious to good counsel, went ahead and did that. He was then arrested and taken into custody. A Judge Advocate General, JAG, officer offered Slovik a last chance, promising to drop all charges if he returned to his unit. He even offered a transfer to another infantry regiment, where no one knew what Slovik had done, thus enabling him to start over with a clean slate. The oblivious GI rejected the final chance to save himself and stated, "I've made up my mind, I'll take my court-martial." Number 13. Be careful what you wish for. It was unfortunate for Private Eddie Slovik that he had chosen the worst possible moment to try and get cute with the U.S. Army. In the fall of 1944, Allied casualties in France were soaring, morale was at an all-time low, and desertions were at an all-time high. To restore order and discipline, the authorities needed to make an example of somebody. Along came Slovik, a jailbird thinking he was smarter than he actually was, openly defying the U.S. military and daring it to do its worst, so it did. It was an illustration of be careful what you wish for. Slovik was charged with desertion to avoid hazardous duty, and got his day in court on November 11, 1944. His confession was presented to the military tribunal, and he chose not to testify. Slovik was not surprised when he was convicted. It was what he had counted on. He was unpleasantly surprised, however, when the court sentenced him not to the relative safety and comfort of a military prison, as he had hoped, but to death. Number 12. A scheme that backfired in spectacular fashion. Too late, Eddie Slovik discovered that he had bitten more than he could chew. His death sentence was reviewed and approved by his division commander, who noted, "I thought it was my duty to this country to approve that sentence. If I hadn't approved it, if I had let Slovik accomplish his purpose, I don't know how I could have gone up to the line and looked a good soldier in the face." A stunned and terrified Slovik, aware that other deserters had been punished with prison and a dishonorable discharge, wrote General Dwight D. Eisenhower, the Supreme Allied Commander, pleading for clemency. Eisenhower rejected Slovik's plea on the morning of January 31, 1945. The condemned private was strapped to a post near the French village of Sainte-Marie-aux-Mines. At 10:04 a.m., a firing squad of 12 soldiers from Slovik's regiment shot him with M1 Garand rifles, killing him instantly. He was the only American soldier executed for desertion since the Civil War. During World War II, over 21,000 Americans had received varying sentences for desertion, including 49 death sentences. Slovik's was the only one carried out. Number 11. The false notion that Alexander the Great conquered history's then greatest empire to date. One of history's greatest generals, Alexander the Great is widely credited with conquering history's greatest empire until then. Alexander, a sublime military genius and a fascinating character to boot, was undoubtedly great. However, the notion that his empire was the greatest that the world had seen until then is false. When Alexander died in 323 BC, history's largest empire until then was still the Persian Empire. The map above is of Alexander's empire at its greatest extent. The map below is of the Achaemenid Persian Empire under Darius the Great, 490 BC. The empires of Alexander and Darius mostly overlap. However, the territory that Darius did not rule in Greece and Thrace is more than made up for with territories he ruled in Arabia, Central Asia, Libya, and the Caucasus that Alexander never conquered. The difference amounts to about 300,000 square kilometers in favor of the Persian Empire at its peak, 5.5 million square kilometers, 5.2 million for Alexander's realm. It took another 2.5 centuries after Alexander's death before the Achaemenid Empire's size record was finally bested by China under the Han dynasty. Number 10. The false narrative of a benign Führer. In 1940, the Battle of France ended in a humiliating defeat, more of a debacle, actually, for the Western powers. In just 6 weeks, the Germans did what they had been unable to do in 4 years during World War I, by routing the British and French armies, and forcing France to surrender. By late May, the rampaging Germans had pushed the remnants of the British Expeditionary Force into an ever-shrinking pocket surrounding the port of Dunkirk, and seemed on the verge of annihilating the defenders. Then, seemingly inexplicably, with a decisive victory over the British in his grasp, Hitler ordered his panzers to halt, and left the task of reducing the surrounded forces to the Luftwaffe. The British took advantage of the breather, and managed to pull off a miraculous evacuation that gave birth to a false narrative to explain what came to be known as the Miracle of Dunkirk. In it, Hitler's halt decision was depicted as a gesture of goodwill, by which he deliberately allowed the British, whom he admired, to escape. As seen below, it is as false gets. Number 9. Far-fetched reasoning to explain a seemingly inexplicable act. In late May of 1940, some German panzer formations were just a few miles from the disorganized British milling about the beaches of Dunkirk. That was when Hitler ordered them to halt for 48 hours in order to rest and refit. The Führer's generals loudly protested the halt, but to no avail. What happened next proved them right. The British made use of the breather to organize a defense that eventually allowed them to evacuate about 338,000 Allied soldiers to safety. Casting about for an explanation for a seemingly inexplicable act, some have claimed that Hitler deliberately let the British go to demonstrate that he did not wish them ill. However, credible mainstream historians give short shrift to the fanciful notion of a merciful Führer letting the British go as a sporting gesture. There is no evidence to support the assertion. Nonetheless, crackpot revisionists have persisted in peddling the false notion that Hitler intentionally let the British escape in order to look magnanimous, and thus draw Britain into peace negotiations. Number 8. How self-serving spin by German generals gave birth to a false narrative. There is no historic support for the false notion that Hitler had intentionally allowed the British to escape from Dunkirk, even for a figure as notoriously irrational as Hitler. Deliberately letting the British escape would have been too irrational. For somebody who wanted to bring Britain to the peace table, holding hundreds of thousands of British soldiers as POWs in Europe, which would have happened if the Germans overran the British at Dunkirk, would have been quite a bargaining chip, more so than if those soldiers were back in Britain, armed and defiant. Additionally, the fatal halt order to halt the German panzer divisions had not even originated with Hitler. A panzer unit commander who had lost half his armored forces and needed time to regroup requested a halt from Army Group A's commander, Gerd von Rundstedt. Rundstedt agreed, and passed it up to Hitler, who rubber-stamped the order to halt. After the war, German generals, including Rundstedt himself, pinned the blame on Hitler instead of on themselves for ruining the opportunity to win the war in 1940. Number 7. The depiction of these dogs conducting alpine rescues, with kegs of brandy strapped to their necks, is false. Saint Bernards were immortalized in Stephen King's horror novel Cujo. The ginormous dogs are named after the Great Saint Bernard Hospice, an alpine monastery atop the Great Saint Bernard Pass, between Switzerland and Italy. The monks bred Saint Bernards in the Swiss Alps, and used them as rescue dogs. Long before Cujo, Saint Bernards were known in popular culture as the dogs that conducted alpine rescues, with a small keg strapped to their necks, full of warming brandy for stranded mountaineers. While that image is captivating, what it depicts is unfortunately false. While the giant Swiss dogs were actually employed in rescue operations, the monks who bred and used them never sent them out with brandy barrels tied to their necks. The first time a Saint Bernard rescued somebody with a barrel of spirits strapped to its neck did not occur in Switzerland. Instead, it took place in England in 1820, in the art studio of then 17-year-old Edwin Henry Landseer. He depicted it in a painting entitled Alpine Mastiffs Reanimating a Distressed Traveler. Number 6. The teenage prodigy behind the false story. The false belief that Saint Bernards ran around the Swiss Alps with kegs of brandy strapped to their necks owes everything to an English teen prodigy. Edwin Henry Landseer was reportedly ambidextrous, and could paint with both hands simultaneously. While one of his hands painted a dog's head, the other would be busy painting its tail, and both would meet in the middle. The creator of the Saint Bernard and brandy kegs myth had actually never been to the Alps. However, Landseer had seen and was impressed by a Saint Bernard, which had not yet gained that name, that had toured England on an exhibit. The Great Saint Bernard Pass, birthplace of the dog breed that became famous the world over, has been used to cross the Alps for thousands of years. The Romans built a temple for Jupiter there, and in 1049, Saint Bernard of Menthon, patron saint of the Alps, built a hospice atop the temple's ruins as a shelter for travelers. Monks maintained the hospice, took care of guests, and guided people through the pass. They also formed search and rescue teams for lost or injured alpine travelers. Number 5. Saint Bernards trace their roots back to giant Roman mastiffs. Monks of the Alpine monastery founded by Saint Bernard of Menthon began training large farm dogs for rescue work in the 16th or 17th century. The big canines were descended from Mastiff type Wallasan hounds that had been introduced to the region by the Romans. Those dogs were strong, had weather-resistant coats, and possessed an exceptionally good sense of smell that made them well-suited to guide and rescue travelers. The dogs were accompanied by monks, who sometimes carried flasks of brandy and shared them with travelers. That might have started the association between St. Bernard Pass rescues and brandy. It eventually grew into the false notion that it was the dogs themselves, not the monks, that carried kegs of brandy over a period of hundreds of years. From the 16th or 17th century to the early 19th, the monks of the Great St. Bernard Hospice bred an excellent search and rescue dog. However, severe winters from 1816 to 1818 saw an unusually high number of avalanches that killed many of the breeding dogs during rescue operations. Number 4. The false but widely accepted belief that St. Bernard rescue dogs look like today's St. Bernards. To save the St. Bernard breed, the dogs that had survived the disastrous stretch from 1816 to 1818 were mated with Newfoundland dogs, imported in the 1850s. The long fur resulting from crossbreeding with the Newfoundlands, a prominent feature of modern St. Bernards, made the dogs less suitable for rescue work. The extra fur ended up gathering snow, freezing and weighing the dogs down. Another false aspect of the St. Bernard myth is the assumption that the rescue dogs look like the current ones, as seen in the above painting of Barry der Menschenretter, the most famous St. Bernard. The original dogs looked significantly different from today's St. Bernards. Original St. Bernards, the ones that did most of the work in the breed's heyday as rescue dogs, were about half as big modern ones. They were roughly the size of German Shepherds, had longer snouts than today's St. Bernards, and shorter fur. St. Bernards got so huge because kennel clubs and dog shows concentrated on appearance instead of the dog's working ability. As St. Bernards became bigger and their fur grew longer, they became less suitable for alpine rescue work. The extra weight caused them to plunge deeper into the snow, while the increasingly longer fur froze and weighed the dogs down even more. Number 3. The most heroic rescue dog of all. The most famous St. Bernard of all was Barry der Menschenretter, weighing about 95 pounds. He was significantly smaller than modern St. Bernards, who weigh between 180 to 300 pounds. He gained the name Menschenretter, which means people rescuer, because he is credited with saving between 40 to 100 people. His most famous rescue was of a little boy, whom he found in an ice cavern. Barry warmed the kid by licking him, then maneuvered him on his back, and carried him back to the hospice. Barry conducted rescue operations for 12 years, As it does with all, age eventually caught up with Barry. When he ceased to be fit for rescue operations, he was parted from the monks and taken to Bern, Switzerland, for a well-deserved retirement. After his death, Barry's body was donated to the Natural History Museum of Bern, and was preserved by taxidermy as an exhibit, as it stands today. However, it is a false depiction of how Barry actually looked in life. A 1923 restoration had altered his pose, and modified the shape of Barry's skull to resemble the St. Bernards of that time. Number 2. St. Bernards no longer conduct alpine rescue. The days of heroic St. Bernard alpine rescues, even without kegs of brandy strapped to their necks, are long gone. They have been replaced with dog breeds better suited to avalanche search and rescue work, such as German Shepherds and Golden Retrievers. Among other things, those dogs have an advantage over the giant St. Bernards, in that their smaller size allows them to fit more easily in rescue helicopters. The last recorded instance of a St. Bernard doing search and rescue work occurred in 1955. However, the dog stayed with the monks for years afterwards. Out of a sense of tradition, the big dogs were kept at the Great St. Bernard Pass Hospice until 2004. That year, the monks sold their entire kennel of 34 St. Bernards to local animal associations. They still return to the hospice every summer during tourist season. Nowadays, because the myth of the St. Bernard and brandy barrel has become so widespread, the monks actually do outfit the dogs with cute little brandy kegs around their necks. Number 1. The false belief that brandy, or any alcohol, warms up the body. There is a widespread belief nowadays, which was even more widespread in centuries past, that brandy or other strong spirits can warm a person. Because of that, the notion that a freezing traveler caught up in an alpine blizzard could be revived and warmed up with brandy makes intuitive common sense. However, a lot of stuff that makes intuitive common sense does not actually work anywhere near as well as common sense says it should. That includes the assertion that alcohol warms us, which is actually false. Drinking strong spirits like whiskey or brandy does lead to a warming sensation, but that sensation is illusory. What alcohol does is bring our blood closer to the skin, which makes us think that we are warming up. What it does not do, however, is warm up our vital organs, whose failure from excessive cold could seriously harm or kill us. Bringing somebody's blood closer to the skin in the cold actually speeds up the lowering of our core body temperature, and places our vital organs at greater risk. So it is a good thing that St. Bernards toting brandy barrels is a myth, otherwise many rescue attempts would have backfired.